Joseph Stalin. Whilst this is a book that is fundamentally about relationships, it is Stalin who dominates the work. And a real insight into the Soviet leader's attitude to the war is gained by examining his behavior immediately before his alliance with the West. This period of the Nazi-Soviet pact between 1939 and 1941 has been largely ignored in the popular consciousness. It was certainly ignored in the post-war Soviet Union. I remember asking one Russian after the fall of the Berlin Wall, how was the Nazi-Soviet pact taught when you were in school during the Soviet era? Wasn't it a tricky piece of history to explain away? He smiled in response. "Oh no," he said, "not tricky at all. You see, I didn't learn there had ever been a Nazi-Soviet pact until after 1990 and the collapse of the Soviet Union." Stalin's relationship with the Nazis is a vital insight into the kind of person he was, because, at least in the early days of the relationship, he got on perfectly well with them. The Soviet communists and the German Nazis had a lot in common, not ideologically, of course, but in practical terms. Each of them respected the importance of raw power, and each of them despised the values that a man like Franklin Roosevelt held most dear, such as freedom of speech and the rule of law. As a consequence, we see Stalin at his most relaxed in one of the first encounters in the book, carving up Europe with Joachim von Ribbentrop, the Nazi foreign minister. The Soviet leader was never to attain such a moment of mutual interest and understanding at any point in his relationship with Churchill and Roosevelt. It is also important to understand the way in which the Soviets ran their occupation of Eastern Poland between 1939 and 1941. That is because many of the injustices that were to occur in parts of occupied Eastern Europe at the end of the war were broadly similar to those the Soviets had previously committed in Eastern Poland. The torture, the arbitrary arrests, the deportations, the sham elections, and the murders. What the earlier Soviet occupation of Eastern Poland demonstrates is that the fundamental nature of Stalinism was obvious from the start. So, it isn't that Churchill and Roosevelt were unaware in the beginning of the kind of regime they were dealing with. Neither of them was initially enthusiastic about the forced alliance with Stalin following the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. Churchill considered it akin to a pact with the devil, and Roosevelt, even though the United States was still officially neutral in the summer of 1941, was careful in his first statement after the Nazi invasion to condemn the Soviets for their previous abuses. How the British and Americans moved from that moment of justified skepticism about Stalin to the point immediately after the Yalta Conference in February 1945, when they stated with apparent sincerity that Stalin meant well to the world and was reasonable and sensible, is the meat of this book. And the answer to why Churchill and Roosevelt publicly altered their position about Stalin and the Soviet Union doesn't lie just in understanding the massive geopolitical issues that were at stake in the war, and, crucially, the effect on the West of the successful Soviet fightback against the Nazis, but also takes us into the realm of personal emotions. Both Churchill and Roosevelt had gigantic egos, and both of them liked to dominate the room. And both of them liked the sound of their own voices. Stalin wasn't like that at all. He was a watcher, an aggressive listener. It was no accident that it took two highly intelligent functionaries on the British side, Sir Alexander Cadogan, Permanent Under-Secretary at the Foreign Office, and Lord Alanbrooke, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, to spot Stalin's gifts most accurately. They saw him not as a politician playing to the crowd and awash with his own rhetoric, but more like a bureaucrat, a practical man who got things done. As Cadogan confided in his diary at Yalta, "I must say I think Uncle Joe, Stalin, much the most impressive of the three men. He is very quiet and restrained. The President flapped about, and the PM boomed."